You know what's crazy? Right now, as you're watching this, there are millions of people sitting in jobs they absolutely hate, jobs that drain their soul, jobs that make them miserable every single morning when that alarm goes off. And yet, they keep showing up, day after day, week after week, year after year. They complain about it to their friends, they dread Sunday evenings, they fantasize about quitting spectacularly, but they never actually leave. Why? What invisible chains are holding us in places that make us so deeply unhappy? Today, we're going to delve into the psychological reasons why we tolerate bad jobs, and I promise you that by the end of this video, you'll see your own career decisions in a completely different light. Let's start with something fundamental. Fear. Not just any fear, but the fear of the unknown. Our brains are wired for survival, and survival means predictability. Even when that predictability is painful, it feels safer than the vast uncertainty of what comes next. Your terrible job might be sucking the life out of you, but at least you know exactly how it's going to suck the life out of you. You know when the paycheck comes, you know what your horrible boss is going to say, you know the rhythm of your misery. That's oddly comforting to the primitive part of your brain that wants to know you'll survive another day. Think about it. When you imagine quitting your job, what happens? Your mind immediately floods with worst-case scenarios. What if you can't find another job? What if you run out of money? What if the next place is even worse? This isn't weakness. This is your amygdala doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, keeping you alive by making you terrified of risk. The problem is, your amygdala can't tell the difference between actual life-threatening danger and the risk of a career change. To that ancient part of your brain, leaving your stable job feels like stepping out of the cave and facing down a predator. But there's something even more insidious at play here, something psychologists call the sunk cost fallacy. You've already invested so much time, so much energy, so many years of your life into this job or this career path. How can you just walk away from all that investment? It feels like admitting defeat, like saying all those years were wasted. So you tell yourself, just one more year, just until I get that promotion, just until I've been here 5 years, just until it looks good on my resume. You keep throwing good years after bad, trying to justify the years you've already lost. Here's the brutal truth about sunk costs. They're already gone. The time you spend is spent whether you stay or leave. But we humans are terrible at accepting this. We'd rather continue suffering to validate our past choices than cut our losses and start fresh. It's like staying in a terrible movie because you already paid for the ticket. The money's gone either way, but somehow leaving feels like admitting you made a mistake buying the ticket in the first place. And speaking of not wanting to admit mistakes, let's talk about identity. Your job isn't just what you do. For many of us, it becomes who we are. When someone asks what you do, you don't say I'm a person who currently exchanges labor for money in the accounting field. You say I'm an accountant. That job title has become fused with your sense of self. Leaving that job means losing a piece of your identity, and that's terrifying. Who are you if you're not this thing you've been for so long? This gets even more complicated when you've built your entire self-image around your career choice. Maybe you spent years in school preparing for this profession. Maybe your family is proud of what you do. Maybe you've introduced yourself this way hundreds of times. Changing course now feels like becoming a different person, and most of us crave consistency in our self-concept. We want to be the same person tomorrow that we were yesterday, even if that person is miserable. Let's add another layer to this psychological trap: social proof and status. Humans are deeply social creatures, and we care desperately about what other people think of us, even when we pretend we don't. Your job comes with a certain level of prestige, a recognizable title, maybe a salary that sounds impressive when you mention it casually at parties. Walking away from that means potentially losing status in your social circle. It means answering awkward questions at family gatherings. It means watching your college friends continue climbing their ladders while you start over at the bottom of a new one. We also tend to compare ourselves to others in ways that keep us stuck. You look around and see everyone else tolerating their jobs, grinding through the dissatisfaction, So clearly that's just what adults do, right? This is called social proof, the tendency to assume that if everyone else is doing something, it must be the correct thing to do. If all your coworkers are staying despite being miserable, if your parents worked jobs they hated for 30 years, if the cultural narrative is that work is supposed to be hard and unfulfilling, then your own misery starts to feel normal. Expected, just part of life. But here's where it gets really interesting psychologically. There's a phenomenon called cognitive dissonance that's working against you in powerful ways. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort we feel when we hold two contradictory beliefs or when our actions don't match our beliefs. You believe you're a smart, capable person who makes good decisions, right? But you're also staying in a job that makes you miserable. Those two things don't fit together comfortably. So what does your brain do? It doesn't change the behavior because we've already established all the reasons that feel too scary. Instead, it changes the belief. Your brain starts generating reasons why this job isn't actually that bad. Sure, the work is mind-numbing, but the health insurance is good. Yeah, your boss is a nightmare, but at least the commute is short. The pay is terrible, but you have job security. You start minimizing the negatives and amplifying the small positives. Anything to resolve that uncomfortable feeling that you're making a choice that goes against your own best interests. This is the same psychological mechanism that keeps people in bad relationships, that makes cults so hard to leave, and that causes people to defend purchases they regret. Once we've committed to something, our brains become masterful at generating justifications for that commitment. And the longer we stay, the more justified we need to feel, which means we generate even more reasons to stay, which makes it even harder to leave. It's a vicious cycle. Now let's talk about learned helplessness, a concept that might explain more about your career than you're comfortable admitting. Learned helplessness was discovered through experiments where animals were put in situations where they couldn't escape negative stimuli. Eventually, even when escape became possible, they didn't even try anymore. They had learned that their actions didn't matter, that they were helpless to change their circumstances. Sound familiar? Maybe you've applied to other jobs and gotten rejected. Maybe you've suggested improvements at work that were ignored. Maybe you've watched other people try to make changes and fail. Over time, these experiences teach you that effort is futile, that you're powerless to improve your situation. So you stop trying. You settle into a numb acceptance, going through the motions, telling yourself this is just how it is. This learned helplessness is incredibly powerful because it makes you your own jailer. The door might be unlocked, but you've learned not to even check anymore. Here's another uncomfortable psychological truth. For some people, the familiarity of suffering is preferable to the uncertainty of potential happiness. This sounds absurd, but think about it. If you've been unhappy for long enough, misery becomes your baseline, your normal. You know how to function while miserable. You've built coping mechanisms, you've adjusted your expectations, you've created a life around your unhappiness. Actual positive change would require you to dismantle all of that, to learn how to operate from a place of satisfaction rather than dissatisfaction. That's not just scary, it's exhausting to even contemplate. There's also a weird sort of identity in suffering. Being the person who endures, who sacrifices, who puts up with terrible conditions, can become a source of perverse pride. It's a form of self-importance. Look how much I can handle. Look how tough I am. Look how dedicated I am to providing for my family that I'm willing to be miserable every day. This martyrdom can be addictive because it gives meaning to the suffering. If you leave and find a job you actually enjoy, you lose that narrative about yourself as someone who endures great hardship. Let's not forget about the practical psychological weight of financial fear. Money isn't just currency. It's security, it's freedom, it's the buffer between you and catastrophe. Most people are living paycheck to paycheck or close to it. The thought of willingly giving up that regular paycheck, even temporarily, even for something better, activates every panic button in your nervous system. What if there's a gap between jobs? What if the new job doesn't work out? What if you've miscalculated and you can't afford your rent? This financial anxiety is completely understandable and often totally justified, but it also becomes a prison. You need the job to pay the bills, so you can't leave the job, so you can't pursue opportunities that might pay better or make you happier, so you stay dependent on the job you hate. It's a trap that's both practical and psychological, and breaking free requires not just courage but often privilege and resources that not everyone has access to. There's also something called the endowment effect at play. This is our tendency to overvalue things simply because we already possess them. You overvalue your current job simply because it's yours. The benefits seem better than they objectively are, the security seems more certain, the downsides seem more tolerable, all because this is the job you currently have. Potential opportunities at other companies seem riskier, less certain, potentially worse, even when objectively they might be better. Your brain is biased toward what you already have, even when what you have is making you miserable. And here's where modern work culture adds another layer of psychological complexity. We've been sold this idea that our work should be our passion, that we should love what we do, that if we're not excited to go to work every day, we're doing something wrong. This creates an impossible standard that actually makes it harder to leave bad jobs. Because if you're supposed to be passionate about your work, and you're not, then maybe the problem is you, not the job. Maybe you're just not grateful enough, not positive enough, not resilient enough. Maybe everyone else has found their passion, and you're just defective somehow. This self-blame is incredibly effective at keeping people stuck. Instead of recognizing that the job is terrible, you internalize the problem. You think you need to change your attitude, develop a better mindset, and practice more gratitude. You read self-help books about finding purpose in any job. You try meditation. You tell yourself that fulfillment comes from within. And while there's truth to personal responsibility and mindset, sometimes the real truth is simpler. Sometimes the job just sucks, and no amount of positive thinking will change that. Let's talk about decision fatigue and the paradox of choice. Modern life requires us to make thousands of decisions every day. What to eat, what to wear, how to respond to emails, what to prioritize, on and on. All of this depletes our mental energy. When you're already exhausted from your terrible job and from navigating daily life, the thought of making a massive life decision, like changing careers, feels impossible. It's easier to just keep doing what you're doing, to stick with the default, because change requires energy you simply don't have. Plus, when you do start looking at other opportunities, you're confronted with an overwhelming choice. Should you stay in your field or change industries entirely? Should you look for a similar role at a better company or a different role altogether? Should you move cities for better opportunities? Should you freelance? Start a business? Go back to school? The sheer number of options becomes paralyzing. It's called the paradox of choice, when having too many options actually makes it harder to choose anything at all. So you choose nothing. You stay put. There's also a psychological phenomenon called present bias that's working against you. Your brain is wired to prioritize immediate rewards and immediate pain avoidance over future benefits. The pain of staying in your bad job is chronic but familiar. The pain of quitting, of going through job interviews, of uncertainty, that pain would be acute and immediate. Your brain, focused on the present moment, will choose familiar chronic pain over unfamiliar acute pain almost every time, even when the acute pain would lead to a better future. This is why we struggle with anything that requires short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. Going to the gym, eating healthy, saving money, and yes, leaving bad jobs to find better ones. The future benefits are abstract and uncertain, while the present discomfort of making a change is concrete and immediate. Your present self has to suffer for your future self's benefit, and evolutionarily speaking, we're just not wired to be great at that calculation. Now let's talk about attachment and relationships, because you don't tolerate your bad job in isolation. Maybe you've formed genuine friendships with coworkers, and leaving means losing daily contact with people you care about. Maybe there's a sense of loyalty to a boss who gave you a chance years ago, even if they're terrible now. Maybe you feel responsible for your team and worry about burdening them with your departure. These emotional attachments are real and valid, and they create genuine psychological barriers to leaving. Humans are tribal creatures. We bond with the people we spend time with, even in negative circumstances. Sometimes, especially in negative circumstances, shared suffering creates powerful bonds. Your work friends might be the main thing making your job tolerable, which creates a cruel irony. The relationships that make the bad job bearable also make it harder to leave. You're not just leaving a job, you're leaving people, potentially disappointing them, certainly changing those relationships. That's a real loss, and your brain recognizes it as such. There's also institutional trust and authority at play. Whether we realize it or not, most of us are trained from childhood to trust institutions and defer to authority. We spent our formative years in school systems where adults told us what to do, and we did it. We learned that organizations and structures exist for good reasons, that the people in charge probably know better than we do. This conditioning doesn't just disappear when we enter the workforce. So when your company tells you this is how things are done, when your boss explains why your concerns aren't valid, when HR says the policies are necessary, part of you believes them. Part of you assumes they must know what they're doing, that the system exists this way for good reasons, that your dissatisfaction is somehow your own failure to understand or adapt. Questioning the fundamental premise that you should stay in this job feels like questioning authority itself, and we're psychologically conditioned to find that uncomfortable. Let's address something that doesn't get talked about enough. Sometimes we stay in bad jobs because the misery is a convenient excuse for why other parts of our lives aren't working. If you're exhausted and drained from a terrible job, well, that's why you're not in better shape. That's why you're not pursuing creative projects. That's why your relationships are struggling. That's why you haven't dealt with your personal issues. The bad job becomes a catch-all explanation for everything that's not right in your life. If you left and found a better job, you'd lose that excuse. You'd have to confront the possibility that maybe the job wasn't the only problem. Maybe you'd still struggle with discipline. Maybe you'd still avoid difficult conversations. Maybe you'd still be unhappy for reasons that have nothing to do with work. That's a terrifying prospect. It's psychologically easier to have one big external villain, your terrible job, than to face the complex reality that you might need to work on multiple aspects of your life. There's also the psychological weight of societal narratives about work and success. We're told that success means climbing the corporate ladder, that job hopping looks bad on a resume, that stability is paramount, that you need to pay your dues, and that good things come to those who wait. These narratives get internalized deeply. Even when you consciously disagree with them, they're running in the background of your mind, influencing your decisions. You might tell yourself you don't care about conventional success, but then feel a pang of shame when you have to explain to someone why you left a stable position. You might believe that passion is more important than prestige, but still feel the sting when someone seems unimpressed by your job title. These internalized narratives create psychological pressure to conform, to follow the expected path, to tolerate the intolerable, because that's what serious adults do. And what about hope? Ironically, hope itself can be a trap. You hope that things will get better. Your boss will leave. The company will restructure. You'll get promoted to a role you actually enjoy. The toxic coworker will quit, and the new management will fix everything. This hope keeps you waiting, keeps you giving it just a little more time, just until after this next project, just until the next review cycle. Hope can be a beautiful thing, but it can also be the thing that keeps you stuck for years, always believing that improvement is just around the corner. This is different from optimism, which might motivate you to actively make changes. This is passive hope, wishful thinking that circumstances will magically improve without you having to take the terrifying step of leaving. It's psychologically comfortable to believe that your patience will eventually be rewarded, that your loyalty will be recognized, that justice will prevail, and that the workplace will transform into something bearable. Reality rarely works that way, but hope is persistent. Let's talk about energy and depression. Bad jobs don't just make you unhappy in the moment. They can literally deplete you of the energy and mental health you'd need to escape. It's a vicious cycle. The job makes you depressed and exhausted, and depression and exhaustion make it nearly impossible to muster the energy to job search or make major life changes. So you stay in the job, which makes you more depressed and exhausted. You're not just fighting inertia, you're fighting the physiological and psychological effects of chronic workplace stress. When you're in this state, even basic tasks feel overwhelming. Updating your resume seems impossible. The thought of networking makes you want to hide. Preparing for interviews, when you can barely get through your workday, feels absurd. You tell yourself you'll start looking once you have more energy, but the job ensures you never have more energy. It's a trap that requires external intervention or a crisis to break free from. And recognizing this pattern is the first step toward escaping it. There's also something called commitment and consistency bias. Once we've publicly committed to something, we feel psychologically compelled to follow through to remain consistent with that commitment. Maybe you told everyone how excited you were to start this job. Maybe you defended your career choice to skeptical family members. Maybe you've spent years telling people this is your path. Changing course now means admitting you were wrong, and our egos hate that. It feels like inconsistency, like fickleness, like failure. So we stay consistent with our past commitments. Even when those commitments are making us miserable, we double down instead of admitting we need to change direction. This is the same psychology that makes it hard to admit you don't like a restaurant you recommended or a movie you insisted everyone watch. But with careers, the stakes are much higher, and the commitment runs much deeper. You're not just being consistent about a dinner choice, you're being consistent about your entire professional identity. And we haven't even talked about benefits and golden handcuffs. Maybe your job has great health insurance, and you or a family member has medical needs. Maybe there's a pension you're close to being vested in. Maybe there are stock options that haven't matured yet. These aren't just financial considerations, they're psychological anchors. The more benefits you have tied to your job, the more reasons your brain generates to stay, and the more trapped you feel. You're literally being paid to endure misery, and that calculation is both rational and soul-crushing. What about age and the psychological weight of starting over? If you're early in your career, changing jobs feels natural, expected even. But the older you get, the more it feels like you should have it figured out by now. Starting over at 40 or 50 feels embarrassing, like admitting defeat, like falling behind your peers. There's a psychological narrative that career changes are for young people who are still finding themselves, not for established professionals who should know better. This is compounded by very real age discrimination in hiring, but it's also deeply psychological. Your sense of time changes as you age. Starting over at 25 feels like you have endless time to build a new career. Starting over at 45 feels like you're running out of time, like you can't afford to take risks, like you need to just endure until retirement. This perception of time scarcity makes people incredibly risk-averse, even when the risk might lead to years of greater happiness. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stopped to calculate how many hours of your life you're spending in this job you tolerate or hate? If you work 40 hours a week, that's 2,000 hours a year. Over a decade, that's 20,000 hours of your finite existence spent in a place that doesn't value you, doing work that doesn't fulfill you. When you frame it that way, the psychological barriers start to seem less important, don't they?